Well, good morning and welcome back to the channel. Now, for those of you that have not seen my videos before and are new here, my name's Rich and I'm a professional wildlife photographer from Devon in England. I'm currently up in the Cairngorms National Park in Scotland running a series of photo tours and workshops, and today I have a changeover day. So I've come out to the forest to try and photograph some wildlife, and I thought I'd bring you guys with me and run you through my top tips on how to photograph woodland birds. Now, wildlife photography is, to me, pretty subjective, especially in terms of how you like to compose and edit your images. But there's a few fundamental things that I've learned along the way, and I like to share with my participants for workshops and tours, which I think help bring their images to that next level. So you found your birds and you've got yourself a nice location. And the first thing I think it's worth discussing is probably your settings and what settings you're going to want to use. Now, bear with me because there's a lot of people out there that find this kind of stuff boring, sometimes myself included, but just bear with me because these little tips are going to help put a smile on your face when it comes to walking away with some lovely, lovely images. Shutter speed. Now, it probably comes as no surprise, but these small little birds are extremely fast. And if you're wanting to capture images of them and freeze all of that motion, then it's a good idea to use yourself a nice fast shutter speed. Now, there's going to be exceptions to the rule, especially when I'm trying to get a bit more creative. For example, when I'm photographing dippers and I'm using a longer exposure to try and blend and blur some of that water. But in most cases, if I'm trying to get a nice portrait or a behavioral image of a bird, then I'm wanting to freeze all of that action. So I want a nice fast shutter speed. It's also a good idea to think about how you can balance your lens and camera. Now, a lot of these big lenses and a lot of our equipment is heavy. And even if it's not initially, after a while, trying to hold it still for long enough in one position can be quite tricky. So if you can get yourself a tripod, a monopod, or even just use something like your camera bag to settle your camera and lens on, that's just going to help avoid any of that movement and motion blur when you're hitting the shutter. So it is a good idea when you go out photographing small birds to consider taking something to support your camera and lens on. The other thing that I'm always thinking about is my aperture. Now, I can't think of too many examples where I'm not shooting wide open. Now, for me, with my 500 prime, that's an f4 lens. So most of the time when I'm using that lens, I'll be shooting at f4. That's going to allow maximum light to come in, and it's also going to give me a nice diffused background and help really make that subject pop. Again, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, and if you're trying to get a nice environmental shot and you're wanting to bring in some of that environment, then you might want to stop your aperture down. But by having your aperture wide open, you're going to be able to keep your shutter speed nice and fast and really throw that background out of focus. The other thing, of course, is to think about your frame rate. So it's all well and good having a fast shutter speed, but if you've got it on single shot and your bird suddenly flies down and you've got less than a second to grab that image, the best thing you can do really is have your frame rate nice and high so you can capture as many images as possible in the shortest amount of time, just increasing your odds of coming away with something sharp. And sometimes it's just the difference between the bird looking here and the bird looking here that can change that image. So think about firing off a few bursts and increasing your chances of coming away with something that you're happy with. And the last thing on settings really is ISO. Again, this completely varies, but sometimes it's a good idea to put your camera, you could shoot fully manual and just control your shutter speed, leave your aperture wide open, and even put your ISO on auto. If you do that, it gives you a little bit less to think about when you're out in the field. And you can just put all of your time into thinking about that shutter speed, thinking about the composition and preempting your bird's movements. The next thing I like to try and think about, with all wildlife to be honest, but definitely with birds, is trying to get eye level. Now, that doesn't always mean that you have to be low to the ground or extremely high up to photograph them in the trees. Sometimes it's just about adjusting your position when you're in the field. For example, when I'm photographing dippers, I'm going to get myself nice and low. Not only does that help make the viewer of the image connect more with the subject, but it also helps render those backgrounds out of focus. However, if I'm out and I'm photographing something like ptarmigan, I'll quite often just try and anticipate their movements and wait for them to walk up on top of a rock or a boulder so that will then put me eye level with the subject. So you don't always need to get low and you don't always need to get high, but understanding your subject and their movements can help you put yourself in the best position to get yourself nice and eye level. Another really important thing to think about is your background. We touched on it before, but it's so important to think about whether or not you've got any distracting elements in your background that you can quite easily remove. Now, it's not always going to be the case when you're photographing wildlife that you can have everything exactly how you want it when you're out in the field. Sometimes things happen so quickly, you've got no time to react to anything. But if you do have a time and you understand your subject and the location well enough, just try and think about your background before you set up. Is there any bright birch trees in the background that are going to cause highlight issues? Is there any tree trunks in the background or horrible distracting branches that are going to come across the back of the bird? Is there anything in the foreground as well that's going to go across the bird's eye or face or feathers? It's all about trying to keep it simple at the end of the day. And if your background's nice and far away, then you're going to come away with some images that are much more pleasing to the eye. But as I mentioned, that isn't always the case with wildlife photography. But you've got to try and adapt to what you've got in front of you. So there's times where I'm out photographing birds and other wildlife, but there's nothing I can really do about the distracting elements in the back of a photo. So instead of trying to remove them and render everything out of focus, I'll actually try and shoot a little bit wider, and I'll include that habitat and that environment in the image. And that can really work as well. So think about that. Is the environment that I'm in, for example, right now, this lovely Caledonian pine forest, would I want to include that behind my subject and bring some of that context into the image? If the answer is yes, and you can't remove any of those distractions, bring it in and think about how you can compose the image to make it work. But you still want to be thinking about whether or not your subject is going to stand out against that background. Ultimately, you want to come away with some nice portraits of the birds, but can you get something a little bit different? And that's where the light can come into play. So we'll move on to that now and we'll discuss light. So we all started out in wildlife photography, and one of the things that everyone used to tell you was how you want to be photographing with the light coming from behind you. Now, whilst that is a useful piece of advice, it's not a firm rule. And actually, quite often when I'm doing bird photography, one of the first things I'm thinking about before I even get out into the field is, what's the light doing today? How's the light going to fall in that location? And what type of images am I after? Now, if the answer is, I want to get nice detailed portrait images of the bird with perhaps some catch light in the eye, then of course I'm going to be shooting with the light coming from behind me. Then 9 times out of 10, I'm thinking about getting a bit more creative and I'm going to be shooting with some backlight. I love this style of photography. I think it helps produce something a little bit different. And whilst I appreciate it's not everybody's cup of tea because you can't see the detail from the birds, if you're photographing something where the profile of the bird is unique to that specific bird, then I think silhouettes and backlit images look fantastic. Like these images of crested tits, it's clear that it's not going to be any other bird because of the way the crest is. And the last thing to probably mention when it comes to light is think about getting out early in the morning and late in the afternoon. Now, we probably want to be out for as long as we possibly can be when it comes to wildlife photography, because let's face it, it's not just about the images, it's being out in nature that we enjoy. But generally speaking, those first couple of hours of light in the morning and those last couple of hours of light in the evening are the ones that are going to give you the best light, and they're going to help bring something extra out in those images. Now, I truly believe that there shouldn't be any rules when it comes to composition and photographing wildlife. That said, I have a few personal preferences that I like to see in my own images that I thought I'd share with you today. And the first thing that comes to mind is negative space. And one of the things I really like to do is have the negative space in the direction where my subject is looking. So if my subject's turned and it's facing out of the frame this way, then I like to have the space in front of it. That just helps give you a sense of thinking about what your subject might be looking at. It helps move the image out into that direction. And another thing, and I've heard so many mixed reviews on this, but when it comes to composition, I personally quite like it when the subject's not looking directly down the lens. Now, I've heard some very good photographers that say that an image is fundamentally flawed if the subject is not looking down the barrel of the lens. But for me, I think it looks a little bit more natural if your subject's not looking directly towards the photographer. I quite like to see the subject looking out at something else and giving you the sense that you're trying to work out what your subject was looking at. So I hope that makes sense, but they're the only two things I'm thinking about. Negative space, giving the subject room to breathe, and having the subject so it's not looking directly down the barrel of the lens. But again, I do want to reiterate that it's subjective. There's no rules of it. Composition can be whatever you want, but that's just what I like. And perhaps the last thing I should mention, and probably the most important thing, is just have fun. Don't be scared to experiment when you're out in the field, especially once you've got those portrait shots already bagged. Once you've got some images like that, and once you've already seen your subject a couple of times, just get fun with it, get creative, think about the light, think about the background, put all of those things together and just see if you can produce something different. Not every single image you get of a bird needs to be filling the frame. Not every single image you get of a bird needs to have the light coming from behind. So if you put all of these tips together and you go out there and you have fun and you're prepared to make some mistakes, because let's face it, we're all learning from our mistakes in wildlife photography far quicker than we're learning from the things we get right. I, for one, know that every time I make an error when I'm out in the field, I'm reluctant to make that error twice, so I'm thinking about it the next time I go out. So if you're prepared to make mistakes and you're out in the field and you're having fun, I can almost guarantee that you're going to come away with some images that you're happy with. So that's it, guys, for today's video. Bit of a different one to normal. Ordinarily, we'd be out in the field photographing and filming wildlife. In fact, that's exactly what we're going to be doing this afternoon and this evening. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. As I mentioned at the start, I'm up in the Cairngorms National Park at the moment, and I'm out most days filming content. So there's loads to come. Mountain hares, red deer, crested tits, you name it. So please, please, please hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what you've been photographing recently, and I'm going to leave the video here, and I'll see you all on the next one.